Are you messing up the most important part of your speech? If you start a speech poorly, then you're going to spend the rest of your time on stage playing catch up. But if you start a speech strong, then your audience are much more likely to take in what you've got to say. Don't start well, and you've probably lost your audience for the rest of your speech. So let's avoid that happening for you and learn how to captivate your audience from the very beginning. I was speaking at an event one time with several speakers, and I saw what was maybe the worst introduction ever to a speech. It was bad. The speaker came up, and right off the bat, they had some tech issues. Now, tech issues are something that sometimes happens at the start of a speech, so I'm not going to apportion any blame to him for that. It was one of those things, but there's better ways to deal with tech, and there's not so good ways to deal with tech. And right off the bat, he got a little bit flustered and aggravated. So by the time that the tech came on and he was ready to start speaking, he wasn't in the best place. His first line was a major red flag. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. If you hear that opening line from a speaker, you know you're about to be in for a boring start to the speech. And that's what happened with this speaker. Whenever someone says, let me tell you a little bit about myself, and they're on stage, they're going to read you their CV. And that's basically what this guy did. And he started off in high school. Yes, he talked about a project he did in high school, and then university, and then this qualification, then this job, and then this industry. It took about 10 minutes for him to rattle off all of the work that he had done and credentials that he'd collected. And it wasn't until 10 minutes in where he said, what I want to talk to you today about is... We didn't care by that point. The audience were lost. I mean, they did care in the sense of hoping that it would be a little bit better, but they had lost their investment in this speaker because they hadn't captivated the audience from the very beginning. I was actually next after this particular speaker, and once I see the writing on the wall in terms of his speech, I started thinking, well, what can I do with my speech on next that's a little bit different, that provides a stark contrast between the way that they started and the way that I'm going to start. I still had the same material in mind, but what I ended up doing was I put a joke at the beginning of my speech. It wasn't a hilarious joke, it was just a bit of commentary on current events. But that joke, as soon as the audience heard the joke, they started laughing, and they were immediately in a much more receptive mood to listen to what I had to say compared to what the previous speaker had to say. And when we ended up getting the general feedback forms for the event, all of the audience put in a feedback form, and the organizer sent it to all of the speakers. I noticed that I was the only speaker who was name checked in the general feedback. Phrases like, David was a breath of fresh air. I loved David's presentation. There were other speakers who had done good speeches. That particular speaker, he was the only one who really messed up the start of his speech. But because I came on afterwards and I provided such a contrast, it made me stand out a little bit more. And that's a good lesson actually for thinking about the start of your speech. You've got to make the start of your speech stand out. It can't just be okay or all right. Your audience has got to go, wow, where are we going with this? This is crazy. I'm hooked. I'm captivated. That's the impression that you want to leave with your audience. Because if you don't get that type of impression right from the beginning of your speech, it's going to be very hard to build into that type of impression by the end of your speech. With that said, let's look at 3 ways that you can blow the socks off your audience from the word go. The first way to captivate at the beginning of a speech is to pose a question. Think about how I started this video. Are you messing up the most important part of your speech? What's happening for you when you hear that question? It sparks your curiosity. You think, what is the most important part of my speech? Well, you might have guessed because of the video title. But if I just came onto stage and said that, you wouldn't know the answer to that. You wouldn't be able to necessarily guess the answer to that. Although you would try and make some guesses. And then you think, okay, what's the most important part of my speech? And if I've guessed correctly, am I messing it up? So there's a couple of layers of curiosity just in that one question. And so your audience's minds are starting to work and they're waiting to have their curiosity satiated. That spark of curiosity is a powerful driver for us as humans. And if you can get that working at the beginning of your speech or your workshop or your keynote, that brings your audience in. It's quite a simple way to open, but there's an elegance in simplicity. So think about how you can get your audience's mind thinking about the subject that you're going to present to them. Turn that into a question, and then they're going to be listening more intently as you start to reveal more information. The second way to start your speech is to make a promise. Ultimately, the audience have a question in their own minds. You may have asked a question at the start of the speech, but they have a question that they're asking you. Why should I listen to you? And that isn't a mean, nasty question. They're thinking, why am I sitting here in this room or sitting at a desk watching something online? Why am I investing that time in what you've got to say? They want the answer to that question quite quickly. And the way that you can give them that answer is to give them a promise. Tell them, this is what you're going to learn by the end of this speech workshop video. I didn't do this in my very first line today, but I did that quite early in this video. I said, we're going to learn how to avoid starting poorly so you can captivate your audience from the very beginning. So now you know when you watch this video, you're going to learn how to captivate your audience at the start of your speech. Not mildly interest them, captivate. So there's the promise that I'm giving you, that by the end of this video, you'll learn some techniques that can get your start swinging for the fences and to continue to build that momentum going into the rest of your speech. So this is the second way you can bring your audience in, because you very quickly answer that unconscious question they're asking, why should I listen to you? And if you give them a very good reason, then they will shuffle, lay back in their seats and go, all right then, let's hear it. Give me more. Our Facebook group, Rise and Inspire Speakers, provides you with a safe, supportive community to develop the skills to get your message out into the world. We host a virtual summit, Inspire Week, within the group every month, where you can sign up for a 30-minute slot to speak live in the group. This is a free opportunity you can sign up for month after month to practice your skills, try new things, and refine aspects of your story and message. There is a ton of educational content that gets pumped into this group. You can access ongoing educational resources that help you gain more confidence on camera, create more compelling speech content, and develop a deeper connection with your ideal audiences. Speaking of connection, the members of our community are fantastic. They are like-minded people who, just like you, want to make a difference in the world and will cheer you on and encourage you every step of the way. If you want to master your virtual speaking skills, then this is the place to be. The third way that you can start a speech is with a contrarian statement. I love this method of starting a speech, and it's one that I use quite often in my YouTube videos. If you've watched maybe some of my other videos, I didn't start with one today, but I'll start with something that challenges a belief or a preconceived notion. Something like, introverts are great speakers. Because quite often the conception of public speaking is that it's for extroverts who are naturally charismatic. And that just really isn't true. but it's a preconceived notion that a lot of people have. And if they don't consider themselves an extrovert, if they don't consider themselves charismatic, then they write themselves off in terms of their speaking ability. What that contrarian statement does is it hooks your audience by challenging a belief that they have quite often about themselves. If they're sitting there going, okay, so there's this speaker, David, who's coming on, he's clearly an extrovert, he seems to have a bit of charisma, not very much, I admit, but some. It's all right for him, but it's not something that I could ever do. And then I come on and I say, introverts make great speakers. That gives them a jolt. They're expecting me to say something different, but I don't. That contrarian statement can provide a very powerful contrast, and it can really hit your audience where they're not expecting it. And when they get blindsided, that automatically perks them up. They've got more attention, they've got more focus right at the beginning of your speech. You are bringing in that attention and focus at that key moment. And if you can grab them then, you're more likely to maintain that attention and focus going into the rest of your speech. That's a strategy that I love, is the contrarian statement. That's why I use it so often in these videos, and I use it quite a lot in my speeches and my workshops as well. So try those openings out. Instead of the, let me tell you more about myself, we don't need any of that. I hardly ever talk about anything that I've done in the past, my CV, my achievements. People often don't know that I've got a university degree because I never mention it. I don't see why that is relevant to what I'm ultimately going to share and talk about, unless I've got a good story from university or I studied something really interesting that applies into the session that I'm talking about and delivering. That's when you might bring in some of your past achievements and professions and jobs and all of that kind of stuff. But don't start with that as a default. Think about, how could I ask a question? How could I make a promise? How could I have a contrarian statement? And maybe see if you can get all three into the first couple minutes of your speech. All of these work synergistically. You don't just have to choose one. You've seen in this video that I've used more than one to try and bring in your attention. Play around with it, have fun with it, captivate your audience, and from that point on, they'll be ready and willing to listen to whatever you have to say.